Thanks for this invitation. Thank you, Zoltan. Thank you, everybody. I apologize for not being able to be there in presence. So I'm very grateful that you gave me this opportunity to connect from Brussels. So I give you a little bit of introduction to the EU policy scene. First, just to recap that we're not talking, when we talk about the EU forest policy, it's not something new, but it's something which has been ongoing for several years or even decades. The first EU forestry policy dates from December 79. The first EU forest strategy from 98. There was a quite well-known green paper in 2010 when we started talking about forest in relation to climate change. Then 2013, the new EU forest strategy, and 2021 again the new EU forest strategy, which is the one with the one we have now until 2030, and then in November 2023, legislative proposals which are being discussed at the moment at EU level on forest monitoring and forest governance. So this just to say that EU forest policy is not something that comes now. It's actually well consolidated policy, although of course that doesn't mean that the results are there in all respects. On the contrary, there's still a long way to go to face the challenges that we have. Now, a couple of general considerations. First of all, it's very important to remember that the EU forest policy is a shared competence with the EU member states, despite what it is often heard in certain circles that forest would be a national competence because forestry is not mentioned in the treaty. That's absolutely not the case. It's a shared competence because, as the Court of Justice said, forest protection is part of environmental protection, which is a shared competence of the EU. And of course, there are also other EU competences which affect forest, not least agriculture, climate, which is part of environment, or disaster prevention. So in all these fields, the EU has exercised its right of taking initiatives and has also legislated. So it's absolutely no question to say that forest is a national matter. But unfortunately, you still hear it sometimes. There was also very recently a written question by Parliament stating forest policy is a national competence. The EU is overstepping its competence. Of course, this was replied the right way with reference to the court judgment and so on. But it comes back very often, this issue. Now, second general consideration, the relevance of forests has increased enormously under the European Green Deal. And that's because forests are at the heart of both crisis, climate and biodiversity, of course, more as solutions than the forests are not the reasons of the crisis. They are the potential solutions and also victims of the crisis in both cases, both climate and biodiversity loss. And today, it's interesting to see that basically all EU institutions and organs are involved in forests. So not only the co-legislator, which are of course discussing the legislative initiatives, but I'm just mentioning here as an example a report of the European Court of Auditors of 2021 on EU funding for biodiversity and climate change in EU forests. That's just as an example. When the European Court of Auditors steps in, that means that usually the policy is well consolidated. And another institution is the European Investment Bank that is very active at the moment in financing interventions on forests. So this just to say that the forest, they now permeate a bit the whole range of institutions in the EU. So that's actually the policy context we have today. This is actually a slide that we use when we present the new forest monitoring framework that you see in the center, but it's very useful to see the different type of instruments that we have that are relevant for forest. In green, the ones of environmental nature, in blue the ones that relate more to climate change, in pink the ones which relate more to bioeconomy, and in yellow those which relate to data gathering, monitoring and accounting. And you can see that there are several pieces of legislation or policy. Of course, these are not only binding legislation, but there are several strategies that have either forest as the center of their focus, like for instance the EU forest strategy, obviously, or they affect forests heavily, like the deforestation regulation, the nature restoration law, the LULUCF, obviously, the carbon removal certification for the part of carbon farming, and so on and so forth. So this is a pretty large. The scope of instruments which affect forests is pretty large today, which is, I think, it's a useful starting point for the future to see what we need, what is working, what is not working, where we have to create synergies, where we have to close gaps. So that is a useful, let's say, mapping exercise. Just before we go on, to recap some basic facts. I mean, you know these things. Forest it's almost half of the European land covered, with, of course, a lot of differences, with 3 countries which have more than 60% forested area, and some countries which are about 1/3, and some which are around 10%. But what is also important to know that in European forests, and actually it was said in the beginning, the attention to forests was for decades in Europe was diverted, or was only, let's say, focusing on tropical forests, and European forests have not been in the spotlight. But it's a fact that more than 85% of our forests are used for wood supply, and that has a price that we pay. The price that we pay, for instance, we practically no longer have primary and old-growth forests that are about maximum 3% estimated in Europe. There's a mapping exercise which is ongoing in the member states, and primary forests, 90% of those are concentrated in 4 countries. Many countries with absolutely don't find any primary forests and hardly find any old growth forests. So that's a fact. So we've gone pretty far in exploiting our resources in Europe. There is a complication which relates, of course, to the ownership regime, because we have an average of 60% private, 40% public. The public forests have, of course, a completely different mission than the private forests, although you don't always hear that made clear. But of course, depending on the situations, there are associations of public forests that they say, well, we do have a social mission which goes beyond just profit making, of selling wood, and that's actually quite important for the future. Then, of course, there is an issue of increase of natural disturbances, which is impacting heavily on European forests. So that is actually something which is very interesting, because if until a few years ago, one could have said that biodiversity in forests would be a luxury to reconcile biodiversity with the current level of exploitation of intensive forestry, particularly the boreal region. Today, that's absolutely not possible, because even if one would say, okay, I don't care about biodiversity, actually biodiversity is the only possibility to have resilient forests. So if you don't have a biodiverse forest, you don't have a resilient forest, and then basically you lose out your resources also for timber production. So that is, if you want, a development which is happening independently of what the legislator does. The climate change is taking a heavy toll on forests, and it's doing it much faster than the legislator is intervening at national and European level. So that is something that happens anyway. So that, of course, informs the current discussion on what to do for the future, and in particular on biomass availability in light of the agenda, which, as you know, is one of the priorities for the future. So I think these basic facts are important to remember, and let's not forget that that's the average composition of forests in Europe. We have a very large share. The majority of European forests are either monoculture or very limited in number of species, which is the opposite of resilience, of course, because the less the forest is biodiverse, the less the forest is resilient. And you can see that half of the European forests have maximum 2 to 3 species. And also 3/4 of European forests are even aged, which means, of course, when the structure is homogeneous, which is done for the purpose of standardizing nature in order to reduce costs for harvesting and for working timber in the sawmills and so on, which is typically what you do in agriculture. You then apply that model to forest. Of course, you obtain forests which are less resilient. So the forest structure today is very much related to that. And then, of course, you know that the carbon sink of forests is going down. These are facts that are shown by science. That in the last decade, the sink related to trees, to forests is going down, and that is, of course, a clear problem in terms of complying with the climate targets that the climate neutrality to in 2050 and so on and so forth. So, and then, of course, not to speak about biodiversity here, I would like also to clarify something, because there is a lot of often criticism that the figures from the Annex 1, this is the biodiversity status on Annex 1 forests, or the forests which are covered by the Habitats Directive, and the result of that are in the State of Nature report, which shows that half of the assessment show poor conservation status. So this is actually a result of the not very satisfactory, actually poor biodiversity we have in European forests. It's very important to mention that this is not area, this is number of assessments, because so it's not the area of the habitats, it is the number of assessments that member states do. If you apply this the criteria of area, you get to different results, but still showing that, of course, we are far from having a satisfactory biodiversity of European forest, but the figures will be different. Of course, it will not be those ones. So this is important to underline. Now, going fast to some conclusive, let's say, some reflection, some food for thought also for your discussions. You talk about the impact of EU policy on forest, or at least this was the topic for which I was supposed to set the scene. The impact of EU forest, of EU policy on forest, of course, it depends very, very much on the instrument that we have, and we do not have one single dedicated instrument on how forests should be managed or should not be managed. We have several pieces of legislation which affect forests either directly or indirectly, either in a general manner or in a specific manner. In some cases, referring to given areas, in some cases referring to given practices. I'll just give you some examples here. For instance, under the Habitat Directive, if you have a forest which is part of a Natura 2000 site, you need, before authorizing any activity which may impact on the ecological values of the site, you need to do an appropriate assessment that might lead to the decision not to intervene if that activity is incompatible with the purposes for the environmental protection of that site. That, of course, becomes more extreme in relation to strict protection, because strict protection, there are guidelines that, of course, indicate that strict protection, although under a Natura 2000 site you could still harvest, that's not incompatible, depending, of course, on the ecological values for which the site has been designated. But in principle, you could still harvest under strict protection. That is not possible, and that concerns the 3% of primary and old-growth forests. Then we have certain standards under the new Renewable Energy Directive, RED III, where we have a geographic standard, in the sense that primary old-growth forests, but in this case, old-growth forests as defined by member states, are excluded from the possibility of sourcing for the purpose of considering the energy produced by this biomass as renewable and get the corresponding subsidies. So there is a kind of geographic standard. There is no outside that. There is no standard except rather general objective related to the way of harvesting with the view not to deplete the soil, in particular in relation to large clear cuts. Then I will not talk about the way this is implemented through particularly through certification. That could be a completely different chapter. We have more precise standards in the taxonomy than we have in RED 3, although they are partly similar, but in the taxonomy, which is a voluntary instrument, of course, is only for the green investments. And in the delegated act on climate adaptation mitigation, you have a number of very precise criteria for ensuring let's say, avoiding to deplete the high biodiversity value sites. So that's pretty important, but that of course only applies voluntarily. It's not a requirement to apply everywhere. We have under the UDR, as you know, an obligation not to degrade forests. So these 4 types of forests: primary, naturally regenerated, planted forest and plantation, and you're not supposed to degrade forests. So that means moving from one class to 2 classes lower than the one forests are, which is of course indirectly a standard for forest management as well. You have a LULUCF, which does not include any forest management standard, but of course with the new LULUCF and the requirement to increase the removal from forests, you need to ensure that forests are more resilient and more vital, and also that we have more forests. We have guidelines. These are actually much more detailed in terms of prescribing, but of course these are guidelines. This is not binding legislation. They do not prescribe the forest management practice. They only suggest the forest management practice on afforestation, on closed nature forestry, and on the mapping and the definition and identification of old growth forests. Work in progress, the carbon removal certification framework, as you know, as it was adopted, it requires a mandatory co-benefits for biodiversity when it comes to carbon farming. So there is a methodology ongoing that is being prepared to ensure that will be the case. And then the nature restoration regulation, of course, also, although it does not impose any standard for forest management, but it requires an improvement of the status of 6 out of 7 indicators. Finally, under discussion by the co-legislator, governance of forests, in order to have a more inclusive governance, particularly when it comes with expert groups with member states, to try to have people involved from different departments which reflect the multifunctionality of forests. This is now being discussed by Council and Parliament. The way it has developed in Council is, for us, not satisfactory. The Commission has made the declaration where it explains the reason why this general approach has not really much added value, and the Commission might even decide to withdraw that, but we have to see what the Parliament will say. That is actually all written in an official declaration of the Commission, and the Forest Monitoring Law, which has been also discussed by Council and Parliament, which would be the instrument that will allow us to improve the knowledge base that we need for knowing where we are and where we want to go, in particular for biodiversity, resilience, climate, and so on. And that leads me to my last slide. Here we go. So the key questions and issues for the future, of course, the main one is how to reconcile the demand for forest-based products with the protection and resilience, and the demand is increasing under the bioeconomy debate. So that is actually the big question. The blanket is not sufficient. We need to ensure sourcing precautions if we want to increase the use of biomass for products and so on. So what should we do? Standards for forest management, that's a question. Under the EU Forest Strategy, you have the announcement of standards for sustainable forest management but on a voluntary basis. And this is something which has been left to the next Commission. We still have to work on that. I already mentioned the governance and the knowledge base. These are the 2 big topics which are discussed at the moment. So just to conclude, I still have 7 seconds. I think that we need to be aware of the complexity of the issue but we need to be aware of the inevitability of further steps in protecting forests, because, as I said before, this is actually strictly related to resilience. I was yesterday in Bonn at the Ministerial Conference on Forest Europe, where there was a unanimous call for more intervention for multifunctionality, resilience, and cooperation. It would be nice to see that quest also at European level, not just at pan-European level, where of course it is a soft law with basically zero enforcement, although of course it has a lot of merits to promote this debate, but it would be nice to have this translated into instruments also at the European level. I'll stop here because I'm beyond the 20 minutes, so thank you very much. If there's any questions, often I'm not available. Thank you.
Hello, Marco. Good morning.
Hi, Toby.
Toby Aykroyd, Wild Europe Foundation. Thanks very much. That was a brilliant resume, as it were, of the forest of regulations, all aiming to improve conservation. The one thing that isn't there at the moment is the link to the financial incentives that foresters and the forestry sector needs to actually implement them. It's one reason why the nature restoration law nearly collapsed. And it's the main reason why there's so much opposition to a more comprehensive forest monitoring law, if we're going to have any chance of putting any of these regulations into practice on a decent scale on the ground. Could you comment on that and what might be put in place to fill the gap?
Yes, thank you. I knew when I heard your voice, I knew you would put this question, Toby. So I think, of course, I didn't touch on the financial aspect. That's absolutely a key enabler. First of all, I would like to say that because it is often, there's a bit of a misconception. The treaty says clearly that it is for the member states to finance environmental protection. So environmental protection measures under the treaty are to be financed by the member states. This is in the treaty, which says that unless it is, of course, disproportionate, then there could be community measures specific. Now, there was a big debate under the NRL and NRR, and you know that there is actually a request from the Commission to produce a report, including on the financial opportunities to finance restoration. That is actually a big chapter, a big question mark, the cost of restoration. Although, as you know, it's also a bit of a biased debate because the cost of restoration are always put, and the same is happening with monitoring. People put in front of you the cost, but of course never do the benefits. And we know very well that €1 invested in restoration or €1 invested in monitoring is a much bigger profit that you get in terms of the results from having better and more healthy forests. So anyway, but just to tell you, yes, this is very much recognized by the Commission, and in fact, even the Commission President made it clear already in a couple of speeches that the big topic for the future will be the so-called biodiversity credit. So we have to try to do the same we did for carbon. For carbon today, companies could put money into certificates that are traded for climate removal or greenhouse gas emission reductions. That doesn't exist for biodiversity except in a few schemes, which are, for instance, Australia has one, the UK has one. But the idea is to try to move to biodiversity credits in a way that this can also be traded, have a value to biodiversity that can be exchanged. We are organizing some tests, in particular on forest with Estonian forests, and it would take time because it's extremely complicated, both from an economic and a legal point of view. But I think that this is the inevitable way to give the right price to the resources. Because today, although it is true that the forest owners is depending on the revenue which is available on the market, it's also true that there is an externality which is not paid by anybody. So when we buy products, IKEA furniture or consume energy, we are causing an externality which is basically paid by the environment, and we need to take care of that. So I think that would be the big topic for the future.
Hi, I'm Aaron, and I'm from the economic side. So we are trying to build a business, sustainable business for this solution. And the problem is there is no connection with the carbon credits. So it's like there is greenwashing in the carbon credit market that we know, and we are trying to build a separate credit market for forests. It doesn't make sense. So we should clean up the carbon credit market in the EU and connect the two incentives, because otherwise, and then it would be market finance. So the states don't have any money to finance this. We shouldn't be looking at the individual states. They are almost broke, most of them. So it has to be a market solution, and we are working on this. So if you would like to have some kind of feedback, we are open to discussion. The technology is available and cheap for monitoring, for remote sensing. We also have the solutions, even for deciduous forests. So not only for pine, so multi-layer forests. So everything exists, but nothing is connected. So the question was spot on. Thank you.
Done.
My last question. We heard yesterday that the EUDR is going to be postponed based on the proposal of the Commission. Can you comment on that, Marco?
Okay, well, very briefly. I mean, on UDR, I know as much as you do. I learned it yesterday from the press release. So you know how this has caused worries in terms of implementation. So I think that this is very new. There is nothing I can tell you that you probably don't know already. So we'll have to see now when the proposal is done, what happens to this proposal in the co-legislature. Just a very brief, I mean, the intervention before was more a comment than a question, but I do agree with you. Of course, it has to be, the biodiversity have to be credible if this is developed. I would just dispute that the states do not have money, because it's a question of choice, because the states have a lot of money when it comes to state aid to certain industrial sectors or to financing certain policies. But of course, environment is always the lowest priority in that case. So I wouldn't say that the states are broken so they cannot protect the environment. They could if they wanted. But of course, I agree with you. We need to bring in the private finance, and we have to do it in a credible way.
Okay, thank you. Just one last comment, Marco, because you said biodiversity. I think it's important to understand that biodiversity actually includes wildlife. Because many times, when you talk about forests, it's just about the diversity of plants. But in reality, the science shows that it's actually animals that are the managers of an ecosystem, and they control the carbon cycle in the end. So, because like Sweden right now is reducing resilience in two ways, I mean, it's logging its forests and it's culling its animals. So, okay, just a remark, the biodiversity must include actually the trophic chain and wildlife.